much, Marcus, and thanks for having me over. It's really a pleasure to try to contribute here with some of the insights from both my new book, but also from our day-to-day practice at MindLab. I'll tell you a little bit about what that is. And in fact, building on this introduction, if there's one point you take away from my contribution, hopefully it could be that we need a different process of creating new solutions or different solutions. And we need to do it with the people, the citizens and businesses and even NGOs that are involved, rather than drafting plans and pushing and delivering solutions to them. Let's see if this runs. So what we do at MindLab, which is a governmental organization, is a public sector unit, is to help three major departments in Denmark run a different kind of creation process, different kind of innovation or policy innovation process. And we do that with the Ministries of Employment, the Ministry of Business and Economic Affairs, and the Ministry of Taxation in Denmark. At MindLab, we have a staff of designers, ethnographers, anthropologists, individuals with an IT background who are applying a different skill set to assist public servants across these silos of government, if you will, but also across different levels of government in designing better policies and better services that will actually work for people. Because when we talk about public sector innovation, really the big question is, how do we get more of what we want? And whether that is in a developing country or it is in an OECD country, policymakers, politicians want something good for their societies. And the question for bureaucrats, if you will, is how do we advise, how do we deliver or come up with the solutions or ideas that might help us get more of what we want? As how do we hit the target, in other words? And the point from the introduction about technocratic or technical reforms is perhaps that we are very, very good at being technical. We're very good at drafting plans and strategies. We're very good at writing a lot of text in government. However, are we good at understanding what it takes to deliver or to create real change? At the end of the day, is anything changed as a result of our work for citizens, for businesses, or for other end users at the receiving end, if you will, of what we're doing? In order to shape or build innovative public organizations, we need to, I believe, work on a number of different dimensions or levels. The one I'll focus on is the process and the co-creation, as I call it. But just to give you the framework, and this is really the essence of the book, these are the elements that I propose could be the core parts of the profile, if you will, of innovative public organizations. The first, sorry, let me go back here. Taking it from the left, the first is consciousness, which means what does innovation as a term and as a concept mean to us in public services? It's something that, of course, the private sector has been very concerned with for decades, but it does have relevance, I believe, to public service organizations. And if it does have relevance, we need to have a language about it. So what is innovation? And one very simple definition, just to get that clear, is new ideas or new ideas that are at least to some extent new to you or your organization that are actually implemented to create value. So ideas that are implemented to create value. It is not about creativity. It's not just about new ideas. It's about the actual transformation or change that are flowing from those new ideas. So just having that kind of consciousness and understanding, and in the book, of course, I sort of expand on that language, also about what value means to public organizations. Secondly, we need capacity. And of course, there's a lot of focus, I know, also in the developing world on building capacity. Well, what is capacity to innovate? What does that mean? And I believe it has to do with both the understanding the political context of how organizations operate in democracies or emerging democracies, could be as well. It is about having strategies for how are we going to work with innovation, having strategies for what we want to achieve substantially. So one thing is having a strategy of how are we going to run projects or innovation efforts in our organization. Another thing is to have a strategy saying what are the big, difficult challenges we're actually trying to tackle. So we do need, if you will, policy strategies or political strategies that are, of course, addressing the content of what we're doing. And we also need strategies that are more, if you will, organizational about how we're going to work with innovation. Finally, before going to co-creation, we need courage, or at least the will to change something amongst leaders at all levels of public service organizations. So that means from actually from the political level, visions about what kind of society do we want, what kind of outcomes are we looking for, to top-level administrators who, if nothing else, should be the ambassadors and the sponsors of innovation, and the enablers, as I call them in the book, the enablers that will allow the time and the resources and the focus in an organization to actually work with innovation. We need mid-level managers who are not just stopping everything in its tracks, but are actually seeing themselves as facilitators of innovation, of processes, allowing staff, employees to not just come up with creative ideas, but actually to drive them through. And finally, we need leaders, managers at the local level and institutional level who are embracing new opportunities to deliver even better services to citizens or other end users, and who are, if you will, knowledge engineers, understood as someone who is seeing how solutions or approaches from other institutions might apply in my context, and really doing the engineering of finding ways that good ideas and solutions could work at the institutional level. Co-creation then is the process, it's the doing, it's the how of creating solutions with people, not just for them. And I call it a systematic process because we can wait around for novel ideas to arrive from anywhere in an organization. But what does it mean to consciously work with innovation, and what is the process? And my argument is that we need to involve a broader scope of people, but first of all end users or citizens, and understand their lives as they're actually lived and the wholeness of their lives in order to understand how might public interventions, regulations, services be meaningful and helpful to them, and also be effective in delivering the outcomes we want. Secondly, we need a new mode of knowledge, which is this qualitative first-hand kind of knowledge where in most public organizations we're very good at dealing with spreadsheets and quantitative data and satisfaction surveys. We even do focus groups, but I'm not talking about focus groups. I'm talking about observing through ethnographic research and anthropological research and through in-depth interviewing with people in their own homes or in their own businesses, in their own contexts, what is it actually like to be that person? And finally, we need a different kind of process for creation. So we need a design-driven process which is fast, iterative, focused on prototyping, which is practical, user-oriented, experimental, all those things that characterize effective work with innovation, if you will. So these are the sort of three components that I believe are core to this concept of co-creating. Just to give a couple of examples of, before going into it in more detail, where it's used already. In Australia, the Centre for Social Innovation is using ethnography and design methods to deal with, for example, chaotic families at risk. And interestingly, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research last year held a major conference in New York on design and cultural research as applied to conflict and peace studies, and to the very practical challenge of integrating, for example, ex-combatants into their hometowns and local settings again. And in fact, the people on this slide, some of them have actually just this weekend started a consultancy or not-for-profit, I think, in Boston called the Policy Lab, which is trying to apply design processes and cultural research and practice, working with a number of governments and the United Nations. So what I'm talking about here might apply also in the development context, something we can explore further. And finally, not that we will go deeply into it, but I think that in any kind of service interaction between citizens or businesses on the one hand and the system of state or local government on the other hand, we have to think of it as more as co-production of a service or an experience rather than as something only produced by professionals to a passive recipient. I know that in the UK right now there's a lot of focus on a big society kind of co-production of citizens, voluntary organizations and others taking over more responsibility for services. That might be one vision of how it could be done. our experience in Denmark is clearly that once you get up close to citizens' actual lives and understand what kind of resources they have and motivations and skills and context, there will arise a number of potential avenues for redesigning or designing services or interventions in ways that are more meaningful to people and that will work better to create outcomes. However, in order to understand how to redesign, how do we discover it? And how do we co-create in order to find more opportunities for co-production? And I call this professional empathy. It's really about trying to really systematically understand what it is that citizens experience, see for ourselves as policymakers or bureaucrats, what is it in fact that is happening when we do something to or with citizens, or what is it that could happen? So going into people's homes like we did at MindLab over a number of years with individuals with a work injury, interviewing citizens who had a severe injury at work and who are now caught up in a system that is focusing on efficient case management, a paradigm of Western countries that's grown over the last many decades of efficient, very cost-effective, mass-scale case management. The interesting thing is when we started doing this research a couple of years ago with the Work Injury Agency of Denmark, we found very quickly that the way that these cases are managed means that people are getting more sick. That the way the system sends 25 letters to people, only 4 of which, by the way, needs to be related to or answered at all by citizens. The language that is used, the focus solely on people's job ability, because this is about insurance claims, not any focus on people's lives that are in ruins, or divorces and people going bankrupt and people leaving their homes and so on. All of this meant, as one of the citizens we interviewed said, that you have to be healthy to manage a work injury case. With this kind of insight, and we shared this insight with our good colleagues in the agency through video clips of citizens sitting in their own homes, sharing all the information, telling their stories. This was substantially enough to help that agency see how it might change very fundamentally how it is dealing with its mission. So right now, this agency is on a course where they're redefining the relationship to citizens, saying we are not just the agency that is managing efficient work injury cases and raising insurance settlements. No, we are an agency that are looking to help citizens back into work and creating job outcomes, and even more fundamentally, we will be the agency that is helping people get their lives back. And helping people get their lives back can actually, by the way, be very, very cost efficient. Because if people get their lives back, we don't have to pay them £500,000 of insurance for lack of workability, because if they can work to some extent, if they do have a full life again, they can get a much lower settlement. And it makes sense then to start investing in how people can get on with their lives. So what is the business case, if you will, of co-creation? It is often to find new ways of delivering much more for much less. And as I mentioned, in Australia, dealing with families that are chaotic, characterized by violence, alcohol abuse, and drug abuse, the Center for Social Innovation there, using design approaches and ethnography, have begun building capacity of such families through peer networks with what they call thriving families, families with resources, but in similar circumstances. So these are the positive deviants that somehow have managed to, in spite of their social circumstances, not end up in such a terrible state. And the first evidence after 1 year of work in Australia is that it is possible to actually tackle this very wicked social problem of chaotic families and make progress. For the first time, by the way, that the state of South Australia and that the city of Adelaide has seen any real progress apart from, by the way, removing children from their families in this field. They've had a public manager seconded to see for herself in this project and to experience for herself what these methods might do, and she is, it has been a really revelation for her in her own words. The second challenge is then, with this kind of insight into how people's lives are, how do we then redesign? What is the process of redesign? And this is where these methods and tools of design and designers come into play. What does it really mean to be a service designer, if you will? And there's some good colleagues or friends of ours at the Danish Design School. They call it rehearsing the future. So how do we play out in practice and understand in practice what is the actual, very practical new process of service engagement that we're looking for. What's the consequence? And I call it prototyping to drive learning. So let's do the opposite of what governments usually do, is to eliminate risk, but actually try to promote risk in the sense of finding ways we can learn and doing it in a way that doesn't kill people, but where we use prototyping and trying out things and experimenting to learn and then to find ways of delivering what is really effective. Of course, it's about a different process of workshops, of creating together, involving multiple agencies, citizens themselves in workshops to look at these insights and try to understand what it means. It's about ideation. All the yellow post-it notes, as you all know about, is connected with innovation. But more fundamentally, it is about trying out for real or in prototyping ways how might services look. So this is an example where we use these small models to have public servants themselves experiment with what might a new service process be like. So for work injury cases, for example, this is what the doctor is going to tell the individual with a work injury. Then this is what the IT system will show online. This is what the trade union, will help the trade union tell their members about what it means to have a work injury case. This is what the insurance companies can do and will and should do to help the case. This is the kind of information package which we are now giving from the agency to citizens, and so on and so on and so on. Simply redesigning from the beginning to the end of a process, all the single steps and stages and experience of citizens. You can even play it out. This is design students playing out at MindLab a climate change policy and just trying it out for size. So you can do acting. This is slightly challenging for bureaucrats, even in Denmark. There's a lot of giggling involved usually, even just doing this stuff. And by the way, we video film it so we can play it back and we can show it to other colleagues. This is probably overstretching a little bit, even for Danish bureaucrats. But finally, just to say that this is just a model of a system redesign, but to say that we have to shift backwards and look at how can we then reconfigure what agencies do, what local governments do, what private actors do, all of it around the citizens' experience and all of it around getting more of the outcomes we want. So for the work injury example, the better outcome is really people back into work and back into a whole life again. To conclude, the three principles I just that I think are flowing from this is, first of all, to go very, very close for insight, and doing it, by the way, with all the actors or stakeholders involved. And this is insight into how value and how change is actually created at the local level. Zooming very far out for redesign, further out than we usually are in our professional silos. And then thinking about moving from mass scale service delivery to actually leveraging resources, whatever resources there are in a certain setting or vis-a-vis certain citizens or groups of citizens to get better outcomes. These are sort of the underlying principles. Much more about it in the book. And I guess a question or something to stimulate the debate further on is something like this. Could or why couldn't these kinds of processes actually help drive reform in countries that are not OECD countries? Is there any reasons why not? And are there also implications for how Western or OECD development agencies work internally or with their partners? Could co-creation not be maybe an approach to creating change through others, which is, of course, I guess, the big challenge in much of the development work? Yeah.